Hi folks, it's Andy, the Analytical Preacher. Our question today is, why do Christians worship on Sunday if the Jews worship on Saturday on the Sabbath? And weren't the Jews required to, so therefore are we required to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy? In answering that question, we'll talk a little bit about some of the Christians today, like the Seventh-day Adventists, who do still worship on Saturday because they believe that those Old Testament commands are still applicable to them today. I'll explain why that's not actually the case. And then we'll look at some other ideas of how Christianity is different from Judaism and how the difference in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant bring those differences out. So first, let's go to the Law of Moses in the Old Testament, and let's see where this idea of worshiping on the Sabbath and its requirement comes from. If we go to the end of the book of Exodus chapter 31, this is where we get the idea that that is an existing law that we should still obey today. Exodus 31 verses 12 and 13 say this, "And the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you and throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." So God had told them in the Ten Commandments, you're to remember this day, you're to remember the seventh day, you're to keep it holy. God reiterates here at the end of Exodus that above all they're to keep those Sabbaths because that's a sign between God and Israel throughout all the generations of Israel. If we go to the second giving of the Ten Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy, we see that it lists out specifically why the Israelites were to be remembering this Sabbath day. I'm going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, and I'm just going to read verses 12 and 15. It says, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you." Verse 15, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So what we see here really in these two passages are kind of two things. This command to remember the Sabbath, even throughout all generations, was explicitly and directly directed to the Israelites, to the Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it was related to the fact that they had been in bondage in Egypt. They had had to work 7 days a week in Egypt, and God had rescued them from that bondage. He had rescued ethnic Israel, the nation of Israel, from bondage in Egypt. And so now he says, just as I only worked 6 days in creation, you should only work 6 days. And as you keep that Sabbath and remember that Sabbath day, it will remind you that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of that bondage. And so immediately as we read that, without looking at anything in the New Testament, which we're going to do in just a second, we would say, I don't think that law applies to us today as non-ethnic Israelites who were never in bondage in Egypt. We would be remembering something that actually was never part of what our ancestors experienced. It's also interesting to note that in the New Testament, 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the books of the New Testament. Obviously, the only commandment that's not repeated is this idea that we are to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, the Apostle Paul refers to what's written in the New Testament as the law of Christ. James, Jesus' half-brother, refers to what's written in the New Testament as the perfect law of liberty. So if this perfect law of Christ, this perfect law of liberty, was supposed to include our worshiping on the Sabbath, it no doubt would have been repeated in the New Testament. It wasn't repeated in the New Testament and appeared to have only been specified for the nation of Israel, even in the Old Testament. But maybe more importantly than that, even beginning in the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, God began to prepare people that a new covenant was going to spring forth from the Old Covenant. The famous verses for that or Jeremiah 31:31. Let me read Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 and 32. The prophet quoting God here says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. And then as we get into the New Testament, beginning with the very early teachings of Jesus, we see that Jesus is making the declaration, I have come to establish that new covenant, not by eliminating the old covenant, but by fulfilling it, by pulling the new covenant growth out of the root of the old covenant until it's completely replaced. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, what we would call the Old Testament. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The Old Testament law wasn't just eliminated. It wasn't even really quote unquote replaced. Rather, it was fulfilled. Everything that the Old Testament law was to do was accomplished in Jesus Christ. And so, though the Israelites were to remember the Sabbath throughout all their generations, that's only throughout all generations while that covenant was in place, while that law of Moses, that old covenant, was in place. Jesus is saying, but I've come to fulfill that. I've come to accomplish everything that was set out to do, which of course then would replace any of the laws in the law of Moses, in the old covenant, that weren't explicitly repeated and set back down for us in the law of Christ, or the perfect law of liberty, or what we would call the New Testament. We get a little bit more information on this. The writer of Hebrews, I'm going to read from Hebrews chapter 8. I'm going to read verses 6 and 7, and then I'm going to read verse 13. And I think it really gives us a really clear idea. This is ethnic Jew writing to other ethnic Jews. So Hebrew was a name for that. This is a Hebrew writing to Hebrews. This is someone who had practiced Judaism, who had become a Christian, who was writing to other ethnic Israelites about this situation. Hebrews 8:6 says, but as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. Verse 13, and speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So the writer here is saying the first covenant wasn't faultless. It was in fact fulfilled, and everything about it was completely accomplished in the life and the work of Jesus Christ. This new covenant that has sprung up from the old covenant, it makes the first one obsolete. There's nothing in that covenant applicable to us as Christians anymore, again, except what would have been repeated in the perfect law of liberty that we call the New Testament. But here's the verse. It's found in Colossians chapter 2. Here's the verse that absolutely just nails everything shut and puts this argument to rest once and for all, period. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church of Colossae, he's writing to them about, okay, I know some of the Jewish members of your church are still saying, shouldn't we avoid this kind of food that was not allowed in the Old Testament? Shouldn't we avoid these kind of things? Shouldn't we practice these sort of festivals? And shouldn't we still observe the Sabbath as we had become accustomed to under the law of Moses? In Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17, Paul writes this, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are the shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let me put that in common English. Paul's saying, I know you've been told you still shouldn't eat pork and you still shouldn't eat shrimp. And I know you've been told that you need to practice all of these festivals about when the Jews were rescued here or the Jews had that. And I know you're being told that you should still observe the Sabbath and worship on that and keep it holy, even though Christians now have this custom of worshiping on Sunday morning. Here's what I'm telling you. Do not let anyone pass judgment on you in regard to those things. Remember, the old covenant is obsolete. It has been fully accomplished by the work of Jesus Christ. And even all of those things that were in that, not eating pork, not eating shrimp, having these unclean issues, remembering the Sabbath, those were just a shadow of the things to come. They weren't permanent ways that we worship God. God had just cast a shadow. He was foreshadowing. He was prophesying what better would come. Those were just a shadow. The actual substance is Jesus and everything that Jesus told us to command. And Christ nor his apostles ever told us to observe the Sabbath. In fact, Paul here in Colossians 2 is saying exactly the opposite. So we can make an argument from the Exodus and Deuteronomy verses. That law was really just for the nation of Israel to begin with, for those and the ancestors of those who were held in bondage in Egypt. Yes, that's absolutely true. We know from Jeremiah, a new covenant was going to come. Jesus says, I was going to replace the new covenant, the old covenant, with my new covenant by fulfilling it and accomplishing everything in it so that we don't have to worry about observing all those things anymore. I'll repeat for you the new things that you do need to continue to accomplish in your life as a believer. The writer of Hebrews tells us, yes, that old thing has been made obsolete by Christ. He mediates a better covenant. Even if none of those verses were in the Bible, and all we had was Colossians 2:16 and 17, we would still, without question, say we are not required to worship on the Sabbath. Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit when he wrote these words. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. That alone, that one sentence would say we are no longer required to worship on the Sabbath. When you look at the bulk of the information, we clearly see that we are not required to worship on the Sabbath. The main reason that we worship on Sunday is simply because it's the example that we saw from the early churches. It's the day that Christ rose from the dead. It's the day that the great preaching happened on Pentecost, when Peter in Acts 2 preached and 3,000 people were baptized the first day. So because it was the day of resurrection, because it was the day of Pentecost, and because all the early churches that were established by the apostles, those that Peter established and the ones that James ran in Jerusalem, and all the ones that Paul and Luke and Timothy and Titus had set up around the Roman Empire, they all worshiped on Sunday morning. We've taken that now as our custom. As I said, I'll close out with a few more items that sort of are different for us as Christians than as it was for the Jews under Judaism. And the first one really has to do with baptism. The nation of Israel was baptized essentially as a nation. Christians, however, are baptized individually. And here's the verse. In 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2, Paul writes this about the Jews who came through the parting of the Red Sea. Paul writes, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Paul is saying, when our ancestors, the Jews, the Hebrews, the Israelites, came out of Egyptian bondage and the sea parted and they following the cloud, they passed through the sea. That was a national baptism for the Israelites that put them under the leadership of Moses. Now, as individual Christians, we now make a decision to be baptized into Christ, to say that now Christ is the leader of our life. We're baptized. It brings us under the lordship of Jesus Christ, if you will, whereas their national baptism brought them under the leadership of the prophet Moses. Our individual baptism brings us under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So baptism replaces baptism, Old Covenant, New Covenant, but it was a one-time national baptism for them. It's an individual one-time for us. I have to say as a footnote here, Baptism does not replace circumcision. There is no replacement for circumcision. The Old Testament ritual of circumcision had to do with them being an ethnic nation, had to do with them being the chosen race of God. It has nothing to do with individual faith or belief. And so because we are not now a single ethnic nation or race, but we are in fact designed to be people from every tribe and every nation and every language and every tongue, there is no equivalent to circumcision. The national baptism of the Jews represents the individual baptism that Christians undergo. Of course, we don't celebrate Passover because my ancestors personally were not rescued from bondage in Egypt. We celebrate rather Easter because Easter is when Christ was raised. So the Jews had a one-time baptism. Each individual believer, we have a one-time baptism. The Jews annually celebrated Passover as the great act of delivery, the great event of delivery for them as a people. We once a year celebrate Easter as the great event of delivery for us as a people. And then the Jews remembered the Sabbath every week. They say, we were delivered from the slave labor in Egypt. And so every week on that seventh day, we're going to remember. And for Christians, we would call that communion. And that's why we see in the early church, for example, look at Acts chapter 20, verse 7. That's why we see in the early church, it sort of became their custom to take communion every Sunday morning, first day of the week, as they gathered together to remember the resurrection, to study the apostles' teaching, to pray and to fellowship together. We're told that they were also taking communion. I think that makes a lot of sense because instead of worshiping on the Sabbath and remembering and keeping it holy to remind ourselves that we were freed from the bondage of physical slavery, we take communion on a weekly basis to remind ourselves that we were freed from the debt of our sin, that we are no longer bound by our sin and we are no longer bound by the debt of our sin. So there are a few things between what we call New Covenant religion or Christianity and Old Covenant religion, which was called Judaism. There are definitely a few differences. We are not required to follow those rules of the Old Testament about not eating pork and not eating shrimp. We are not required to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. We're not required to observe Passovers and sacrifice lambs exactly the way that they're supposed to be done. Rather, we are to be baptized as individual believers into the Lordship of Jesus Christ. We are to worship on Sunday because that's the example we saw from the early church, and it reminds us of the great resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if we want a weekly celebration, it wouldn't be the Sabbath. Rather, I believe that it would be, again, following the example of the Bible, following the biblical example of the early churches. I believe our weekly celebration would be the taking of communion together to remember that Christ rescued us from the bondage of our sins. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.